How do you do? How do you do? Music.
Hello, and welcome to the Laurel and Hardy podcast. And if you think Laurel and Hardy are magic, you're in the right place. This is episode 38, and as the purpose of this podcast series is to follow the lives and careers of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, today's episode brings us to the spring of 1929, and our film in focus is something of an oddity. It's not a Laurel and Hardy film, it's not even a film made at the Hal Roach Studios. This is Stan and Babe's first appearance in a feature film. Yes, it's their cameo appearance in MGM's second talking picture, The Hollywood Revue of 1929. Now, as this is just a brief cameo appearance, it did pose a little dilemma. Should I devote an entire episode to it, or should it just be a segment as part of another episode? Well, when you consider the fact that this, at the time, was a huge coup for Stan and Babe, MGM, the biggest and most powerful movie studio in Hollywood, had requested the appearance of Laurel and Hardy in their big, sensational feature-length movie, a showing off, if you will, of all their top stars. No, whatever you may think of the film itself or the sketch the boys perform, this was a significant moment in their career to date. And so, for that reason, episode 38 is devoted entirely to the Hollywood Revue of 1929. So then, my next dilemma is which guest to invite on. Well, that was an even easier one to answer, actually, because who do I know that knows a lot about Laurel and Hardy, a lot about the plethora of stars in the MGM stable, and about music from the late 1920s? Who can speak at length about all these things? Of course, there's only one man for the job, and Randy Skretvedt leapt at the invitation. So we'll be joined by Randy a little later in the show. But before we begin the episode proper, I just want to say a few words, if I can, about our Laurel and Hardy magazine. Now, you'll probably be aware by now that the issue that Russ and I published a few weeks ago is the last physical issue that we're going to produce. Yes, it's sad, disappointing news, and it actually made a lot of our readers quite upset. But sadly, Russ and I felt it was the only sensible option given the rising costs of printing and shipping, but also the huge amount of time it takes us to not only produce the magazines, but also the administration and the logistical challenges involved before, during, and after publication. Russ and I both have very busy full-time jobs, and sadly it was all just getting too much. And importantly, we weren't getting enough time, or any time really, to focus on finishing the Laurel and Hardy Silence book, which is so important to us. But of course, this is not the end of the magazine, as we will be continuing to produce new issues digitally on Amazon Kindle and Apple Books platforms, with all back issues also being made available. If you're interested in any of that, for more information on the changes to the magazine and the availability of the digital issues, just visit our website, laurelandhardyfilms.com/magazine, and we'll keep you updated through there. Now, the physical magazines was also an important part of the benefits received by patrons of the podcast signed up to the Plumtree tier. So the end of the physical magazine will obviously have a knock-on effect on the benefits of that tier. So I want to take this opportunity also to announce a new benefit to Plumtree members that will kind of be replacing the magazine as a benefit. And it's something that I really do think you're going to like, and I'm quite excited about. Each month, I will be inviting all members of the Plumtree tier to attend and participate in an online discussion of a particular Laurel and Hardy related topic. So it may be we discuss the film in focus for that particular month, obviously linked to the latest podcast, and even perhaps discuss the podcast itself. Or we could be looking at or discussing an important Laurel and Hardy book, like, I don't know, the Mr. Laurel and Mr. Hardy by John McCabe. Any number of topics, really. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. It'll give me a chance to meet and chat with my patrons directly every month and enable a much greater sense, I think, of community amongst the listeners. It's ideal for those of you who perhaps aren't able to attend Sons of the Desert meetings, let's say, or who don't know anyone else with a shared interest in the boys. I'm going to call the discussion group Fraternally Yours, and as I said, it will be available to everyone who has signed up to my Plumtree tier on patreon.com, and meetings will be held online using the Zoom platform. If you're not already a Plumtree member, you can join today, of course, by clicking the Patreon link on my website, laurelandhardyfilms.com, or by clicking the link in the podcast show notes. And of course, if you're already a member of the Lower Elements tier and you'd like to be involved in the Fraternally Yours group, you can upgrade to the Plumtree tier anytime you like. And finally, on the subject of Patreon, I'm thrilled to welcome the following listeners who have become patrons in the last few weeks. So huge thanks and welcome aboard go to David Lewin, Michael Errett, Jack Cleveland, John Williams, Mike Greenfield, Nick Kunupius, Tony Lewandowski, Nicole Arciola, and Paul Fitzpatrick. So welcome aboard, everyone, and thanks for your support. It means so much to me. And all those patrons I've just mentioned, I think, am right in saying, have signed up to the Plumtree tier, and so you will receive an invite to the Fraternally Yours discussion groups, as well as all the bonus podcasts and other benefits as well. So I think that'll do for now. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats, as it's almost time for the curtain to go up. Today's film and focus is the Hollywood Revue of 1929. Filming began in March 1929 with Laurel and Hardy scenes shot on May 27th, 1929. It was produced by Harry Rapp for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and directed by Charles F. Reisner. It was released on November 23rd, 1929. At the Hal Roach Studios, it was reasonably common for multiple comedies to be in production at any one time. Yet May 1929 was a reasonably quiet month on the lot, especially regarding film crews using the sound stages. Charlie Chase's Leaping Love took a week to shoot and wrapped on May 3rd, and the following picture to get underway in front of the cameras was Laurel and Hardy's Men of War, which began filming 4 days later on May 7th. Yet, with most of Men of War's principal photography taking place at the picturesque Hollenbeck Park, the Laurel and Hardy unit was on location for the majority of the shoot. The film was completed at the park on May 15th. 2 days earlier, on May 13th, Edgar Kennedy, Eddie Dunn and the rest of the cast began a 4-day shoot on a Roach all-star picture called Dad's Day. However, once again, much of the photography on this also took place on location. Rounding off the month, Charlie Chase's next comedy, Snappy Sneezer, featuring Thelma Todd, wouldn't begin filming until May 25th, with only a few scenes of this shot at the Roach studio, with the remainder of the action again taking place out on location. It could be said that the Roach's sound stages were having something of a spring break. The same could not be said, of course, for the many people who worked on the lot, such as the editors, carpenters, painters, writers, admin staff, and studio executives, etc., etc. For them, it was business as usual. One particular executive, the studio's general manager, Warren Doan, was directing Charlie Chase on Snappy Sneezer. This was the third Chase picture in which Doan shouldered the directorial duties. Since Leo McCary's departure, Warren Doan had added the role of director to his list of regular duties, mainly out of necessity. The experience gained through this allowed him deeper insight into the mechanics of filmmaking on the Roach lot, and he believed all studio officials should have a decent working understanding of the challenges his directors were faced with. Quote, "Executives and studio officials should direct at least one picture, in the opinion of Warren Doan. By doing this, the executives will realize and understand more fully just what directors are up against." Doan, who has been general manager of the Roach Studios for 9 years, decided it was time he learned something of the art of handling the megaphone. He got a double dose of instructions in his first experience. In directing Charlie Chase in a talking comedy, The Big Squawk, he was initiated into the technique of both the camera and the microphones. he is learning his art under the tutorship of Charlie Chase, who for 10 years directed comedies before turning actor." End quote. And that was in the Exhibitor's Herald World, June 1st, 1929. Warren was not alone in this enlightened stance, of course. Hal Roach himself knew all the intricacies of filmmaking, having worked hands-on in the industry for many years and learned the craft from the ground up. In this way, the producer and his general manager knew firsthand what it took to get a film from concept to completion, and what better way to lead a movie studio. This hands-on ethos filtered down through the ranks at the Roach studio. An attitude of cooperation and togetherness where everybody mucked in and pulled their weight, no matter what their position or what department they worked in, was observed across the lot. It wasn't just the absence of trade unions in Hollywood around this time that resulted in employees consistently going way over and above what their roles demanded of them. Staff at the Hal Roach Studios loved their jobs, liked and respected their bosses, and would happily carry out all manner of tasks for however long it took to get the job done. Talking pictures had successfully eclipsed silent movies as the dominant medium of cinema. Any doubts about their credibility or longevity, and there had been many, had now been well and truly laid to rest. Sound was the crucial element in filmmaking now, and musicals were particularly in vogue. The novelty of being able to enjoy song and dance numbers within films had really caught on, and so during 1929, all the prominent movie studios produced versions of musical or revue-style pictures. Their primary purpose was to show off their array of stars, highlighting what an embarrassment of riches they had, and positioning themselves as the #1 studio for talent. Bizarrely though, even stars not known for singing or dancing were pushed in front of the cameras and microphones and expected to do a turn, with varying degrees of success. The triumphant release of MGM's all-talking, all-singing, all-dancing picture, The Broadway Melody, released on February 1st, 1929, prompted the studio to begin working on a follow-up picture almost immediately. Rehearsals for the Hollywood Revue of 1929 began on February 4th, 1929, and filming took just 25 days at a cost of $426,000. The film was billed as an all-star musical extravaganza and followed a simple variety/vaudeville show concept. It had absolutely no plot whatsoever and was filmed from a theatre audience's perspective, with the actors performing to the static cameras as if a live audience were watching. All of MGM's stars, with the notable exceptions of Lon Chaney and Greta Garbo, conspicuous by their absence, were included on the conveyor belt of acts. Jack Benny and Conrad Nagel assumed the roles of Masters of Ceremonies, and artists including Joan Crawford, Marie Dressler, Bessie Love, Charles King, William Haynes, Norma Shearer, John Gilbert and Buster Keaton all got their turn to entertain. In Buster Keaton's words, quote, "Everybody at MGM who could sing, dance, talk, whistle or mumble appeared in this one." End quote. The eyebrow-raising decision to produce a movie with no plot was credited to the film's producer, Harry Rapf. Quote, "MGM's Hollywood Revue of 1929 will be closely watched by the entire industry as the first musical extravaganza production without any attempt at a plot. This radical step was passed up by a number of other studios in making musical talkers. Practically the entire star and featured player list at Metro was used in the picture, in addition to vaudeville and musical comedy names. Credit for initiating the departure from all accepted production standards is given to Harry Rapf, well-known producer who has fostered a number of outstanding films in the silent and talking era." End quote. And that was from Hollywood Filmograph, June 15th, 1929. Pulling together a talent showcase such as this wasn't easy, as many of the film's star turns were occupied during the day shooting their own pictures. There was little option than to shoot most of the acts during the graveyard shift, between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. As I said, rehearsals for the Hollywood Revue began on February 4th, and filming commenced the following month with Christy Caban in the director's chair. However, after the first 2 weeks of the shoot, a rough cut of the picture totaled 9,172 feet, with many of the more prominent acts still to be filmed. Producer Harry Rapf stepped in, and Caban was replaced by a new director, Charles M. Reisner. Reisner had an excellent body of work behind him as both actor and director, especially in the field of comedy, appearing in pictures such as Charlie Chaplin's A Dog's Life, The Kid, and The Pilgrim, and was credited as an assistant director on The Gold Rush, as well as directing Charlie's brother Sidney Chaplin in The Man on the Box and The Better Owl. In addition, Buster Keaton identified Charles, or Chuck, Reisner as not only the director of Steamboat Bill Jr., but also the individual behind the original story idea. Despite the logistics involved in putting a project like this together, filming on the Hollywood Revue took just 25 days. However, although the film was packed with a roll call of MGM's greatest names, the studio was apparently dissatisfied with the end result, feeling that something was missing from the overall offering. That something evidently was a proper comedy turn. Even though the film had a major headlining comic like Buster Keaton in the mix, the film was still lacking out-and-out comedy. Keaton, who was yet to make his first talkie, appeared on set in April 1929 and selected to perform a reworking of his Princess Raj dance. An unusual act, mixing dance and acrobatic stunts, Keaton's choice of routine notably required neither scripting, dialogue, or anything out of the great comedian's comfort zone. So with an urgent need to fill the comedy void, MGM reached out to their Culver City neighbour, Hal Roach, and inquired about the possibility of loaning his two biggest stars, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. Proof, if proof were needed, of Laurel and Hardy's popularity and status as the fastest growing names in screen comedy. This would be Stan and Babe's first venture away from the Hal Roach studio as a team, but it would not be their last. The boys were thrilled to be asked to contribute to a big budget feature at the greatest studio in the world and the chance to rub shoulders with some of the most elite players in the business. Stan was particularly excited at the prospect of meeting Buster Keaton, who he had long idolised. Typically, the experience was something of an anticlimax, as the time demands placed on the boys did not allow for socialising or consorting of any kind. Fortunately, a few weeks later, Keaton, Stan and Babe all attended a party at which they were able to meet and share their admiration for each other's work. But with literally no time to prepare, rehearse or write anything elaborate, Stan came up with a simple sketch casting their characters as bumbling stage magicians. Stan likely dipped into his vast experience and knowledge gained from years of toiling on the music hall and vaudeville circuits for inspiration. In the spring of 1916, Stan had become part of a double act with a fellow vaudevillian named Bob Martini. Martini had a pre-existing and popular burlesque magic act called Martini and Maximilian, and for one reason or another, the performer playing the role of Maximilian quit. Stan Jefferson, out of work and likely attracted by the security of Martini's string of bookings, took up the role of Martini's assistant and became the comedy foil of the act. In a letter to magician Charlie Jackson, dated May 20th, 1957, Stan described the act. Quote, "I worked in a magic and illusion act. We were known as Martini and Maximilian. I was doing the comedy. After he had done his trick and gotten big applause, I would by accident expose them. Those were the happy days." End quote. So the fact that this brief but succinct description of a vaudeville act from 1916-1917, in which Stan co-starred and evidently held fond memories of, also serves to describe Stan and Babe's performance in the Hollywood Revue of 1929 is surely no coincidence. With Roach's blessing, Stan and Babe attended the MGM set on Monday, May 27th, 1929, and completed their preparation, rehearsal and filming in just 6 hours. The appearance totals around 6 minutes of the review, and the act begins with a heavy stage curtain being drawn back to reveal Stan and Ollie with their backs to the imaginary audience, still preparing themselves for their performance. Their skit, performed beside a table adorned with the words Laurel and Hardy Magicians, consists of Ollie attempting to perform illusions and magic tricks, while Stan, as the assistant, haplessly reveals either how the trick was done or how it was about to be done. For instance, at the start, Stan politely tips his hat to Jack Benny, and in doing so releases a dove, which had been stashed there as the payoff of a later trick. During a tussle between the two boys, Ollie kicks Stan in the seat of his pants and so crushes the egg that was secreted in his back pocket, leaving Ollie to declare to the audience,
"The egg trick is out!"
Laurel and Hardy are remarkably inept magicians, but their naive charm and willingness to entertain the audience is completely disarming, and the audience can't help but be won over. Interestingly, Babe Hardy delivers all the dialogue during the sketch, and Stan doesn't utter a single word throughout the entire 6 minutes. It is Ollie who forces proceedings along. As Laurel was undoubtedly used to using his voice by this point, having already filmed 3 talking comedies for Hal Roach, one wonders if the Maximilian character from Laurel's vaudeville days was also silent, and it was for that reason that Stan chose to perform silently in this sketch. Despite Stan's silence, reports appeared in the press, albeit likely lifted from MGM's publicity press book, about Laurel and Hardy's destructive volume levels. Quote, Laurel and Hardy just about blew out all the sound apparatus light valves when they put on their hilarious magic act for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's big musical motion picture spectacle. The popular comedy stars took their first bow on the MGM lot as a pair of magicians who have tricks to perform, but too many personal squabbles to settle to bother about the tricks. The sound department, unused to such outlandish antics before the sensitive microphones, worked overtime, replacing the light valves Laurel and Hardy blew out in their rampage of knockabout hilarity. And Charles Chuck Reisner, the director, was so pleased he presented Hardy with a fresh batch of eggs to smear in Laurel's hair. End quote. And that was in the Star Press, Muncie, Indiana, August 24th, 1929. The intriguing overall aspect of the Hollywood Revue was that, apart from Laurel and Hardy, the artists were not necessarily performing in the sorts of acts that had made them famous or that showed them at their best. Most of the entertainers were required to sing and or dance their way through the segments, whether they were adept at the disciplines or not. For instance, Joan Crawford singing and dancing the Charleston is perhaps not what viewers may have been expecting. In addition, the static positioning of the cameras did not allow for the more significant song and dance numbers to be shot dynamically and artistically, as would shortly become the norm in the celebrated musicals featuring the likes of Fred Astaire, and with highly choreographed and visually stunning routines by Busby Berkeley. Yet, the novelty factor of the acts and several segments shot and presented in 2-color Technicolor carried the picture to widespread acclaim. The Hollywood Revue of 1929 was a huge success with the movie going public, turning in a global profit of $1,135,000, making it MGM's second most successful film that year. Not only that, critics also praised the picture, resulting in it being nominated for the Academy Award for Outstanding Picture 1928-29, but sadly it lost out to MGM's first talkie, The Broadway Melody, which went on to become the most successful picture that year. The film received its world premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theatre, Los Angeles, on Thursday, June 20th, 1929. The promotional campaign, headed by Pete Smith, head of MGM's West Coast Publicity Department, was described as one of the biggest exploitation campaigns in the history of the industry, and with good reason. Quote, "Living lettered sign exploits the opening of Hollywood Revue." Probably the first human billboard ever constructed for exploitation of a motion picture was erected to publicize the opening of the MGM's Hollywood Revue of 1929 at Grauman's Chinese Theatre. This sign, the letters of which were formed by living girls, was erected on the busiest boulevard of Los Angeles, and for 5 blocks in either direction the streets were roped off to traffic. The sign measured 40 feet in length and 35 feet high, was set on a silhouette of Hollywood's skyline base with an effigy of Grauman's Chinese Theatre placed in the center. The letters in the sign spelled Hollywood Revue and were of the raised type covered with silver cloth with the girls in the channels. The whole sign was lighted with colored lights and made a striking appearance. Bessie Love acted as master of ceremonies and pulled the cord which unveiled the display. Thousands of people who had gathered to see the display gave a thundering applause, which was recorded by the newsreel photographers. End quote. And that was in Exhibitors Herald World, July 6th, 1929. The live element of the billboard was only a feature for the premiere, with coloured photographs of the dancers replacing the real thing for the remainder of the promotion. This incredible publicity stunt was reenacted for the East Coast premiere held at New York's Astor Theatre on August 20th, 1929. Quote, "Superlative! That is one-word review of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's latest opus, The Hollywood Revue of 1929. Howard Deitz crashed through with his human billboard. 26 girls in red, white and blue, mostly feathers, looked down on the surge of traffic in Times Square from the biggest billboard in New York. And they did more than look down on traffic. They stopped it. Broadway stopped and gazed in wonder. We mingled with the crowd. The human billboard, garishly reminiscent of the circus, fulfilled its major purpose. It attracted attention, and plenty of it. It was not an easy job to fight our way into the theatre, but it was certainly worth the effort. Talk about audience reaction. They ate it up. Even a mawkishly sentimental song by Charlie King about your mother and mine, the only critically objectionable thing on the programme, was lapped up. And King more than made up for his initial delinquency by some rare comedy work which had us rolling in our seats. The names of the cast were something to conjure with. Never had there been such a galaxy of talent in any show, legitimate or otherwise, and never was a batting average so high. The consensus of opinion indicated that the screen was really beginning to show the stage what it could accomplish in sheer entertainment. The Hollywood Revue of 1929 gave you more for your money than any revue in town. MGM deserves a lot of credit for turning out such a uniformly good piece of work, and so does Charles Reisner, the man who directed it." End quote. That was in the Exhibitors Herald World, August 24th, 1929. The Hollywood Revue received its domestic release on November 23rd, 1929, and was a sensational success. With all the in-house talent at their disposal, the request made to Hal Roach by MGM, the biggest studio in the world, for the use of Laurel and Hardy's services proved just how strong the team's reputation had become within the industry. It wouldn't be long before MGM came knocking again for their help to rescue another lavish blockbuster, but for the time being, it was back down the road to Hal Roach's lot of fun to make more fabulous two-reel comedies. So as our chronological look at Stan and Babe's career turns to focus on the summer of 1929, the next film the boys appeared in together was something a little out of left field. I'm talking, of course, of their cameo appearance in the Hollywood Revue of 1929. Now, this is a film that I've not been particularly fond of over the years, let's say, but thankfully I know a man that is. Joining me to hopefully enable me to see this picture in a new light is Laurel and Hardy expert and friend of the podcast. It's Randy Skretvedt. So as always, I'm thrilled to say welcome back to the Laurel and Hardy podcast. Randy.
Thank you. You know, this ought to be the Laurel and Hardy podcast.
Absolutely. That's right. I just don't know how you spell that.
POD-DUH, I think, would be the correct spelling. Podcast. True Laurel and Hardy fans will get the joke. So
they would. They absolutely would. And people who aren't Laurel and Hardy fans would wonder what the hell it meant.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, thank you for having me on the podcast again.
Oh, not at all. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on, because I know when I realised that the next film for the podcast to focus on was the Hollywood Revue, I knew I needed someone. I needed a film aficionado that would know something hopefully, about the other acts in this rather lengthy and, in my opinion, tedious film. And Randy, you were the first person I thought of because of that. And so
Because I too
you
am
can.
lengthy and tedious,
I did
as I
not
will
say
prove
that.
in the next hour.
I did not say that. No, no, no,
Ah,
no, no, no. But you can imagine my relief and response when your response was not, positive about coming on to the podcast, but also that your feelings towards the film are also quite positive. So that is great.
well, I am probably one of the few people who enjoys this film, and because, as you may know, for at least 42 years now, I have hosted a radio show here
Yes.
in the Southern California area called Forward into the Past, where it's a 3 hour show. It's on every Sunday afternoon here. It would start at 10 o'clock on Sunday night in the UK. You can get it worldwide at www.kspc.org. And it's a 3 hour show, and the first and third hours are devoted to recordings of popular music from mainly the mid 1920s through the early 1940s. And the middle hour is devoted to golden age radio or old time radio. So programs featuring our friend Jack Benny, whom we'll be talking about in this film,
Yep.
or other comedians or dramatic shows from that period. So I try to cover all of the audible entertainment from those years. And as a result, having done this show for 42 years, I have, for the show, acquired thousands and thousands of records of this type of music. And I particularly love the late 1920s. So
Right.
that's one reason why I have an affection for this film, and I'm a little more attuned to it than most people. I'm sure for most people, it's just really a creaky curio antique, and I don't think it was ever reissued, because I'm
Mm.
sure it seemed very old fashioned.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
it was shot very quickly and efficiently. It did not cost a lot of money. It made a pile of money and was nominated for Best Picture of the Year,
Yes. Amazingly.
in the second Academy Award ceremonies. This was MGM's second all talking film, and it lost the Best Picture award to MGM's first all talking film, which was The Broadway Melody, which
Ah,
stars Charles King and Bessie Love, who figure prominently in this film.
right.
And because this film was so successful, and of course, the musical was a type of film that hadn't existed in the silent era. So
Yeah.
everybody was rushing to make this new type of movie. Uh,
Right.
Paramount made Paramount on Parade. Fox made one called Happy Days, and Warner Brothers made The Show of Shows. And those are all similar review type films featuring whoever happened to be under contract. And there they were showcasing their singing and dancing abilities, even if they didn't have any. So one
And
thing
there are
about
a
these
few.
films is it sort of, if any, sometimes it exposes the flaws of
Mm.
these people's performing ability, because they're called upon to do something that's out of their comfort range, as we would say now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
So this was only MGM's second talking picture.
second all talking film, they've done a few that were part talking, but the first one
Right.
that was MGM was always very conservative about new technological advances.
Yeah.
Fox and Warner Brothers seemed to be the ones who were eager to try the new things, and
Yeah.
the executives at MGM said, "Well, let's let the other studios iron all the bugs out and get
Mm.
all the problems taken care of, and once this new technology is working smoothly, then we'll adopt it." So
Yes. Yeah.
that was
So
their
I
philosophy.
guess so in a way then a lot of the stars or majority of the stars that are in this film are not accustomed yet to being in talking pictures. Am I right in that? Because that would be one way of looking at it.
Yeah, this was shot in the spring of 1929, May and June. In fact, Laurel and Hardy were at it at the very last minute,
Yes.
just as they would be for the Rogue Song.
Yes, that's right.
So
Yeah.
I think it's a case of them looking at what they thought was the completed film and saying, "Gee, we need a little more comedy. There's that little lot a mile up the street. Let's ask our pal Hal Roach if he'll loan Laurel and Hardy to us." And I'm sure that Stan wrote their little bit of business very quickly, maybe the day before. Who knows? I mean, it has a minimum of props. It's very simply shot, and they were signed to the film on June 1st, and the first preview of the movie was June 15th. So just over 2 weeks later, they had a complete cut, and it was released. It got an actual release on June 20th. So that tells you how far along in the production it was before Laurel and Hardy became part of it.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a question on that. I mean, I was reading Scott Iman's book, The Speed of Sound, which I adore.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a fabulous book. But he actually writes in there. But I've got the quote here. Other numbers. Where are we? Other numbers took several days to rehearse and shoot, but Laurel and Hardy contribution was completed in 6 hours on May 27th. Which is interesting. It's interesting.
Well, yeah. All right. Well, sometimes the news of things doesn't reach the newspapers until afterwards. May 27th. True. Well, yeah. I did not have access to the daily production reports, so I'm going to write that down.
Write that down.
next time we do a new layout of Magic Behind the Movies, I will remember that. May 27th.
Yeah, it's the big date. Yeah, so that was quite interesting, I thought.
And 6 hours. Okay, that doesn't surprise me.
And you could quite honestly see MGM thinking, the comedy here isn't very funny. What the hell do we do? In my mind, let's put it that way.
Or it's a different kind of comedy. When you read the reviews from all those sophisticated New York critics, they're just falling all over each other, telling you how wonderful this movie is. Right. So if anything, this film shows you what the competition was like for comedy and what was thought to be sophisticated comedy. It was more dialogue oriented and certainly not as universal. I was going through some of the reviews. Mordaunt Hall of the New York Times. Mordaunt Hall has the track record for at least as far as we are concerned, being wrong about more movies. Movies that we think are classic, he doesn't like at all, and movies that we don't like at all, he thinks are classic. Right. But he said it was brimming over with good fun and catchy music, and that's in the New York Times. Variety said the top novelty film to be turned out to date. If the theater booths give it an even break, nothing can stop it. Film Daily said a smash and a wow. Smart review with plenty of comedy, beautifully dressed in a cast that is gilt-edged. And the New Yorker, the most sophisticated publication in the 1920s, said, quote, the most extravagant and extensive musical comedy so far presented by the Talking Pictures and is in itself a complete evening's entertainment. And it made a profit of $1.1 million. So it was shot in 25 days with a budget of $426,000 and made well over that in profit. So there you go. That is what was considered to be smart, sophisticated, the ultimate in entertainment in those days. What's interesting right from the get-go is the early roar for Leo the Lion. That famous roar that we see through so many MGM films all through the 30s and into the 40s was actually shot silent and was used in a lot of their later silent films. So they had to create a roar when the talkies came in. And there are a couple of early ones before they hit upon the one that we most associate with Jackie the Lion, Jackie the Lion roaring there for the camera. And this first one doesn't even really sound like an animal. It sounds like a tuba or something. So that's kind of unusual. Also interesting that the billing is Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, but it's Dane ampersand Arthur for Carl Dane and George K. Arthur. So it's not Laurel and Hardy. And they really, I don't know that they ever were billed as Laurel and Hardy. It was always Stan Laurel, Oliver Hardy. So
yeah, that's a good point.
I can't really think of a film where they're billed as Laurel and Hardy as such. Then we have the title, the Hollywood Revue, spelled out in this sign with all these girls. It's a huge sign with girls adorning it. And they actually did that for the premiere. They had a living marquee.
I seen you a book, isn't
it? There's a picture of that in Magic Behind the Movies, a full page picture of it.
That's right.
These poor girls out there in the cold, in these scanty uniforms, adorning.
Oh, were they real people?
Oh, real people.
They were real people.
Probably hoping that they weren't going to fall off. So
yeah, good grief. Good grief.
So what they would do for publicity. Now, there is an inordinate amount of non-dancing dancing in this movie. There were so many musicals being made, first of all, on Broadway and also in Hollywood. I think in the Babes in Toyland book that came out a couple of years ago, I was able to find that there were 62 feature films that were musicals in 1929 made in the United States, and a further 63 made in 1930, which is why nobody
Wow.
wanted to see them starting in 1931. There were just too many of them. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, but there were so many that the studios could not find actual dancers, and so you will find choreography that anybody could do. In fact, if you see the Marx Brothers movie, The Coconuts, you see another example of this. If you're familiar with that film, there are girls who play the bellboys, and they do this bit
Yes.
of business where they do a circular motion with their hands and they nod to the left, and a circular motion with the hands and they nod to the right.
Yeah.
And because it's coordinated movement in unison, it looks sort of like it's dancing. It's not,
Right.
but it's something that
Right.
everybody can do. And so you will find lots of people marching in step, or going in diagonal directions, or hopping, just all sorts of things over and over and over again that aren't really dancing. So that's something that's
Yes. Yeah.
kind of fun to me. Is you say, okay, well, how are they faking the dancing in this number?
Yes.
Because
Exactly. Exactly.
they should have been able to get somebody like Hal Skelly or an actual dancer to do at least one number, but I guess they didn't have
Yeah. Yeah.
anybody under contract at Metro at that time to do actual dancing. There's also a visual effect called solarization, where they go back and forth from a positive state to negative and back and forth to negative. And once again, citing the Coconuts, they do that over the main titles of the Marx Brothers movie, The Coconuts. It's in negative state. Uh, so that's something they were trying to do to bring a little visual variety. They clearly did not know how to shoot these things. For one thing, the music was probably all done live on the set, and the singing. So they had to have a boom mic somewhere or a mic somewhere. Um, a lot of these numbers are shot as if we're in a theater watching everybody on the stage, and it's great to have that experience, to know what it would have been like to see a Broadway show or a chorus line at that time. But it also means that for movies, three-quarters of the picture is this empty space above the row of dancers. So that's not terribly cinematic. And they resolved that problem very quickly, because if you see the 1930 Eddie Cantor movie Whoopi, that has choreography by Busby Berkeley, who figured out how to do the overhead shots with all the kaleidoscopic effects, with the dancers moving back and forth as if they were in a kaleidoscope. He found more cinematic ways to do dance numbers, so that you don't just have this row of dancers on the stage, and then a big backdrop behind them taking up most of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see what else we have here. Um, uh, oh yeah, they do things like they wave the tambourines around. That's another thing that they do. That's just unison movement. Then we
Yeah.
have our master of ceremonies, who is Jack Benny.
Boys and girls, be seated. And now, friends, may I present our interlocutor, a gentleman who really needs no introduction, one of the shining lights of Screenland, whose name is on the tip of everyone's tongue. I refer to my friend and pal, friend.
Now, I don't know how familiar people are in England with Jack Benny. He was a major comedian for years and years in America, and you can still obtain most of the radio shows that he did. And for me, the radio shows that Jack Benny did in the post-war years, from say 1945 through 52, are really the funniest the radio comedy that has ever been. I mean, they are still wonderfully funny shows. Of course, he had yet to develop his character of this vain a very, very miserly fellow who was perpetually 39 years old, a joke which got funnier and funnier as he got older and older. Um,
Right.
I remember one which he did when he was actually 75 years old on television. And a little girl comes up on stage and she says, "Hello, Mr. Benny." And she says, "I hear it's your birthday." And he says, "Oh, yeah, well, yes." And he says, "Now tell me, little girl, how old do you think I am?" And she says, "Oh, I'd say 39 or 40." And he said, "Well, actually, I'm a little older than that. Now guess again." And she says, 75. And he just, and as he does, he just stares and stares and stares and stares, and you wonder what's going through his mind as he finally gets up with great effort. So anyway, it's Jack Benny. Oh, Jack Benny's story about this. He didn't quite remember it properly, but I'm going to tell it the way that he told it.
Okay.
At one point, he actually introduces Cliff Edwards with this word, but he remembered it as introducing Conrad Nagel, who was the other master of ceremonies. And Jack Benny, he did it on a Merv Griffin talk show in the early '70s. He said, I'm the master of ceremonies with Conrad Nagel. And at one point, I'm supposed to say, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, Conrad Nagel, a name to conjure with." And the director said, "Oh, wait a minute, Jack. We want you to say that as a name to conjure with." And Jack says, "Yes, but that's not the right pronunciation. It's conjure." And the director says, "Yes, but we have a gag planted later in the film where Conrad Nagel is going to criticize you for mispronouncing the word conjure as conjure." And Jack says, "Oh, well, okay, in that case, I'll do it." So he says, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, Conrad Nagel, a name to conjure with." So they go on and they film it. He says, "Now the film is finished. It's the big premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theater. I'm there. Everybody in Hollywood is there to see this major new film. I come on and I say, and now, ladies and gentlemen, Conrad Nagel, a name to conjure with." And so I'm watching the rest of the movie and I'm waiting for Conrad Nagel to come on and say, "Jack, that's not the way you pronounce it." And I'm waiting and waiting, and the film is over. And I went up to the director and I said, "What happened to the line where Conrad Nagel was supposed to criticize me for saying conjure?" And he says, "Oh, well," he says, "the film was running over long, so we had to cut that." And he says, "Well, why didn't you call me back and say it the correct way?" He says, "So now everybody in Hollywood thinks I don't know how to speak English, and I'm stuck with that lousy word conjure." So anyway, he does say that about Cliff Edwards, a name to conjure with no further reference to it in the film. So that was his memory mainly of this film.
The next number, ladies and gentlemen, will be a song by Cliff Edwards.
Hey, I don't want that.
You don't want an introduction?
Certainly I want an introduction, but not that kind. I want a nice introduction like Conrad Nagel gave Charlie King. Used all those big words and said all those nice things about him. Say, I got a voice that's like a breeze and it's full of zithers. You tell them how I thrill them. Go on, tell them.
Oh. Well, all right, listen to this.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next number is really the high spot of our review. A name to conjure with. A name that is a beacon light in the world of amusement. A name that is synonymous with crowded theaters and cheering throngs. A genius, an artist, an entertainer.
Cliff Edwards.
Who?
Ukulele Ike.
This also features Charles King, who had starred in Broadway Melody, mainly a Broadway star. He didn't make many movies, but he was in the Broadway Melody, as was Bessie Love. And you'll see Cliff Edwards, who, if he's remembered at all today, he's remembered as the voice of Jiminy Cricket in the Walt Disney film of Pinocchio. And he was also on American TV for the Mickey Mouse Club, the Mouseketeers. But in the late 20s, he was very popular on Broadway and on phonograph records, known as Ukulele Ike, although his real name was Cliff Edwards. You will see in this movie Joan Crawford. If you only know Joan Crawford from Mommy Dearest, the scandalous book that her daughter wrote about her, or the movie starring Faye Dunaway, or if you only know Joan Crawford from her later horror movies like Berserk, it's rather disconcerting to see her introduced as...
Here's one of my favorites, and I know you all like it too. because she's the personification of youth and beauty and joy and happiness. Joan Crawford.
That's awfully kind of you, Conrad. Thank you.
I think Joan has a surprise for you.
The personification of youth and beauty and joy and happiness. And see her come out as this hotshot flapper girl, not wearing a lot of makeup and doing a Charleston. Well, she was actually a prize-winning dancer, and that's how she got to MGM, as a dancer, not as an actress. So that she gets to show off her dancing chops. And she's not a bad singer, and I really like that song, "Got a Feeling for You." And I particularly like the vocal quartet in back of her. So that's a style of singing that you find in the late 20s and at no other time, where it's vocal trios or quartets singing in close harmony and doing some pretty jazzy improvisation, or not improvisation, but pretty jazzy arrangements.
All day I talk about you. All night I think about you. I just want to be someone you want to see. Why, you got me walking on air. I only hope that you care. I'd be satisfied just to hang around you. Crazy about your smile, free and easy style. You're a loving child, got a feeling for you. Ooh, I like your turned up nose. I like your seasoned up suit. From your head to toe, got a feeling for you. No one but you.
Let's see. And then we have a minstrel show, girls with top hats. And once again, they do a bit where everybody hands a top hat to the person behind them in row after row after row. So again, it's all coordinated movement, but it's not really dancing. So
Yeah, that's right.
They-
Yes, they pass the hats in front, and then with the other
they
hand,
just go
pass it back or something.
And because they all do it rhythmically and they're all doing it, you just go, oh, look how they're dancing, but they're not really. Okay, then we have Cliff Edwards and Conrad Nagel do a joke about Conrad having done torrid love scenes in movies with Greta Garbo, and Cliff's wife having seen one of these at a theater and then coming home and promptly hitting Cliff over the head with a chair, having evidently realized how inadequate he is romantically. So that's the story behind that. Charlie King then sings a song called "Your Mother and Mine."
Your mother and my mother too were angels whose hearts were a shrine, and the one up above sent his message of love through your mother and mine.
There were several nice records made of that song, particularly one made by the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, featuring Bing Crosby on the vocal and Bix Beiderbecke in the trumpet section. And speaking of Paul Whiteman, that's another musical review that came out after this film called King of Jazz, which is quite a bit more entertaining, and the whole film is in 2-color Technicolor, and there is a beautiful restoration of that available on Blu-ray. So if this type of review film intrigues you, that's another one that's available. The other ones aren't. I wish Paramount on Parade were available, because I've seen that one, and that is quite entertaining. Far more than this.
Intrigues is a good word.
Well,
Intrigues
yeah, I mean, if this period of show business, I mean, a lot of these people who were major stars at MGM would be deposed within a couple of years, because really by 1931 you had a lot of new people coming from Broadway who became the new stars, the first generation of purely talkie stars. So people like John Gilbert and Bessie Love and William Haynes were going to be gone for one reason or another, and replaced by these new people coming from the stage. Let's see. We have Conrad Nagel at the piano miming to Charles King singing "You Were Meant for Me," which is one of the two songs that became standards out of this movie. The other one being "Singing in the Rain."
You were meant for me. I was meant for you. Nature patterned you, and when she was done, you are all the sweet things rolled into one.
The song's written by Ignacio Herb Brown and Arthur Freed. Arthur Freed became a producer of many of the major MGM musicals in the 1940s and 50s. And both of those songs were featured in Singin' Apostrophe in the Rain. Now, it's Singing in the Rain in this film with a G on the end.
Right.
But the Gene Kelly film of 1952 is Singin' Apostrophe in the Rain. And really a good companion piece to this film, because it's about that transitional period from silence to talking.
Of course it is.
And
Yes, of course it is.
when Betty Comden and Adolph Green were putting the script together for Singin' in the Rain, they knew that many of the people still employed at MGM had been through this transitional period. And so they asked them about all of their war stories of contending with
Right.
this new technology, which nobody knew much about, and all of the problems that they had with it. And so a lot of the very funny sequences in Singin' in the Rain have their roots in real life sequences, particularly with regard to John Gilbert. Now, this is John Gilbert's first sound film, and he was a romantic idol. I think he first really came to prominence in The Big Parade, which is a World War I film made by King Vidor for MGM. And in that one, he doesn't have a mustache, and it's just a straight dramatic role. But he became known for romantic films, particularly with Greta Garbo, who also became his off-screen love interest. And they famously were going to get married in a double ceremony with King Vidor and Eleanor Boardman, but Greta stood him up. She left him at the altar, and so that was rather unfortunate. King Vidor and Eleanor Boardman went ahead and got married, but John Gilbert was left high and dry. And he's always cited as being the ultimate casualty of talking films. When you hear him in this film, he has a tenor voice. It's probably a little higher than you would have anticipated, but it's not a bad voice. And had they given him material similar to Ronald Colman, his voice is rather similar to Ronald Colman's. And Ronald Colman in 1929 made a film of Bulldog Drummond, which was very successful and was suited very well to his voice. And had they given John Gilbert that, I think he would have been a success. But unfortunately, because he was already known as a romantic, passionate lover, well, they gave him a dialogue that was, "I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you." And not only was it silly dialogue, but people were embarrassed to see a passionate love scene and hear it as well, because you no longer had the remove provided by silence in a silent film. And that made it a little, it was not quite as in your face as we would say now. When you see it and hear it, it's a little embarrassing, like you suddenly opened the door and found a couple in fond embrace, So, they did not choose material wisely for John Gilbert, and I think that more than anything put an end to his career in talking films. Well, anyway,
Is he what the artist was based on?
Probably. I mean, The Artist is a lot like A Star is Born, the many different versions of A Star is Born, where someone who is an unknown becomes a star while the star begins to fade. It's really the same basic story.
Yeah, of course.
So, of course, there is a happy ending for that one.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that's true.
The one big flaw of that movie is he decides to commit suicide by sitting in an apartment where he's got all these reels of film, and he sets them on flame and they start smoldering. Well, nitrate film does not smolder. It goes up that fast. And if he had set any of it ablaze, that entire apartment would have been in cinders by the time that Oogie the dog could get to the fire department. So, but I still like the film a lot. So,
well, yeah, we'll forgive it. Yeah,
aside,
it's a very good film.
What else? Cliff Edwards does a song called "Nobody But You," while a chorus behind him sits and sways, once again doing non-dancing dancing. Then we have Jack Benny playing his violin. Now, he actually was quite a good violinist, but for comic effect, he always played it a little bit off key, and that was a key element of his character that would develop later on in radio and television.
Right.
This is an embryonic Jack Benny. He's 35 years old, and at this point was known as a monologist and a master of ceremonies. And he still has that sort of quiet, slow style. Unlike a lot of people who did this type of work, a lot of them were very brash and very theatrical. There's a guy named Harry Rose who does the same sort of thing for some MGM shorts that were made in 1930, and you can see those on the DVD of Broadway Melody. And he's very theatrical and comes out, "Hello, everybody, here's Harry. And now we have a wonderful little girl, and she's going to do a terrific number for you." And, that was more what you would find in the theater.
Yeah.
And so Jack Benny comes out and he says, "And now, ladies and gentlemen," and he just does that, his usual slow-paced talk with, and he always emphasizes certain syllables. That's the key to doing an imitation of Jack Benny is, he has this way of saying certain words that just sort of jump out at you. So anyway, I got to see him live in person in 1969 when I was 10 years old. So that's a wonderful childhood memory of mine because he was wonderfully funny.
Well, this thing that happened to Charlie King will certainly be a lesson to me. I'll argue with no movie stars.
Pardon me.
Oh, miss, your face is familiar to me. Didn't I meet you in Omaha? I never forget a face.
Okay, then we have Dane and Arthur. And if they are remembered for anything, it's probably for the sad demise of Carl Dane. Now, there's another casualty of the talkies because Carl Dane, as befits his name, was Danish. And he was very popular as comedy relief in films like The Big Parade that King Vidor made, this World War I epic. But he had a very thick Danish accent and was not able to acquire a more American way of speaking. And unfortunately, was soon dropped by MGM. He and George K. Arthur made a couple of films for low-budget studios, but Carl Dane wound up running a little hot dog stand outside the MGM studios, for which he had once been a major star, and ultimately committed suicide. So that's about as sad a story as you can find for people who were casualties of the talking screen. George K. Arthur then went into the distribution end of the film business and lived to a ripe old age, but was no longer a performer. But very sad about Carl Dane. And then we have another person who left MGM for other reasons. We have William Haynes. Now, William Haynes is also remembered for reasons other than his motion pictures, and that is for being one of the few, as we would now say, out and proud performers of his era. He was gay, and he had a long-time relationship with a man named Jimmy Shields. They met each other in 1926 and became a very devoted couple. And William Haynes had become a star right around that time in an MGM feature called Brown of Harvard. And he made several starring films where he's usually a very brash young man who is a little too big for his britches, and at some point in the film, something will happen to him that gives him a much needed dose of humility. And so he then becomes a much nicer and likable character. One exception to that is a film called Show People, which stars Marion Davies, and which is modeled very closely on the real life story of Gloria Swanson. In that, Marion Davies plays an actress named Peggy Pepper, and she starts in the movies in a slapstick studio, doing rough and tumble live action slapstick comedy, visual comedy with pies in the face and all that sort of stuff. And William Haynes is one of the boys in the company. And then she is discovered by a big director, and she becomes Pamela Le Pepois. And she is put into these costume epics, just as Cecil B. DeMille did for Gloria Swanson. He took her from the Mack Sennett studio and put her into very elaborate costume dramas. In the film Show People, the Marion Davies character becomes very snooty and high-handed and wants nothing to do with those rowdy slapstick people that she knew. But ultimately, once again, just as William Haynes has happened to him in so many movies, she sees the light and is brought back down to earth. That's a wonderful film.
Right.
It's available on DVD. Everybody should see it. Show people. Directed by King Vidor, and it's a movie just about as far removed from his big film, The Big Parade, as you could get. So anyway, that's a really good William Haynes movie. And he made the transition to sound very well, because as you do here in Hollywood Revue of 1929, he has a good voice. And in fact, he made a film in 1930, a feature film called Way Out West. Every once in a while, I find sheet music from that. But in 1933, Louis B. Mayer called him into his office and he said, I know that you're in a relationship with this man, Jimmy Shields, but we can't let that be known to the public. That would be ruinous for you and for MGM. And Billy Haynes said, I don't need this. I have other things to do with my life. I'll see you later. I'm staying with my partner. Thank you very much. Because Mayer wanted to arrange a marriage with a woman for William Haynes. And he said, sorry, I'm already married. And so he had already started to do interior design for a lot of his friends in the movie colony. And Joan Crawford was a particularly good friend of his, and she started promoting him as an interior designer. And he became a very, very well-known and sought-after interior designer, refashioning the people's homes. He and Jimmy Shields were very close friends of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. Well, until William Haynes died in 1973. And at that point, he and his partner had been together for 47 years. And unfortunately, Jimmy Shields was just so devastated that he took a bottle of sleeping pills. And he left behind a note saying, I'm so lonely without William Haynes, with whom I've been since 1926. And it's just better this way, and so long. So he just couldn't face life without his longtime partner. So there is a good book about him called Wisecracker by a guy named William J. Mann. So if you want to learn more about William Haynes, there's that book. Then we have Bessie Love, who actually moved to England and made several movies in England. And she's interviewed in the Kevin Brownlow documentary series Hollywood, and she's very engaging in that. And there's a bit where there's a miniature Bessie Love that's hiding in Jack Benny's pocket, and he brings her out and holds Bessie Love in her hand.
Now, folks, I have a little surprise for you. I'm going to introduce Bessie Love, and I have her right here in my pocket. I had her here a minute ago. Bessie, where are you?
Here I am, Jack.
Now, what are you doing over there when I put you in this pocket?
But I don't like that pocket. There's nothing in it.
Just like a woman. You can never tell what pocket you're going to find her in. Now, get out of there, Bessie. That's where I keep my money.
But I can't get out. My foot's stuck on a $20 bill.
Can't be my coat.
I don't know why that was considered to be so amusing, but they do the same thing in the Paul Whiteman movie King of Jazz. The entire orchestra is shrunk down to miniature size, so go figure. She's actually quite good. She sings and plays the ukulele, and she does a number called I Never Knew That I Could Do That, do a thing like that. And she's actually quite good. But then once again, then the chorus boys come in, and instead of dancing, this time they pick her up and they throw her back and forth. Once again, no real dancing, but a lot of visual synchronized activity. So Then we have Marie Dressler doing a number called But I'm the Queen. Now, Marie Dressler is probably the most unlikely major movie star of the early 1930s because she was already in her mid-60s. She was overweight. She was gruff. She was not particularly pretty. But she became a beloved star in 1930 until she passed away of cancer in 1934. She was Hollywood royalty. And she had been a big star up through the late teens, the 19 teens. She made a film of Tilly's Punctured Romance with Charlie Chaplin in 1914 and subsequently made some other Tilly films with other producers. But she got involved with a strike by the actors against the Broadway producers. And because she was so visible in this strike, which ultimately failed, she was sort of persona non grata and really could not get work in movies or in on the stage for many years. I think at one point she was working as a maid, but I think in 1928, she was asked to do a co-star in a feature film at MGM, which wound up being a big hit. And this may well be her first talkie. Later on in 1930, she is in Anna Christie with Greta Garbo. And she was a big hit in that film. And then she was a big hit in a film called Min and Bill with Wallace Beery. And later on one called Tugboat Annie. And so she made a series of comedies with Polly Moran, who's also in this film. They did one called Politics and one called Reducing. Politics has Jackie Lynn from Pack Up Your Troubles in the cast.
I've got a new bedtime story to tell you.
All right.
Once upon a time, there was a little girl, and her name was Goldilocks. And she lived at home with her mama and her daddy. And she went way out in the woods.
So she became a big star, and the fact that she was an elderly, overweight, not very good-looking lady didn't matter because she had great charm and she was a fine comedic actress. So here she is at the beginning of her second great career. Let's see. Oh, yeah, Jack Benny comes on in armor after this number because William Haynes, rather ironically, William Haynes's bit of business consists of systematically disrobing Jack Benny, which, in light of later knowledge, was rather amusing. And then we have Laurel and Hardy.
Now remember, don't take your hat off.
How do you do?
How do you do? Didn't I tell you not to take your hat off? Don't shush me. Don't pinch me like that. Pardon me.
Hey, the car where you throw that stuff, you want to knock somebody's eye out?
My mistake. Shut up.
And then they come on and they do their routine. I don't know if in England you are familiar with Penn and Teller. Do you know Penn and Teller?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
They are a comedy magic act. And they consist of a rather stocky fellow named Penn Jillette, who just turned 70 the other day, and his scrawny little assistant Teller, who never speaks. And Laurel and Hardy sort of are precursors to this because Stan Laurel doesn't say a word in this movie, in this scene. And it's pretty rudimentary. I mean, it's, the typical thing of magic tricks gone wrong, which would later be refined to a high art by a man named Carl Ballantine, who was a really good comedy magician where the tricks all fall apart on him. But, you have Ollie supposedly shuffling the cards, but unfortunately revealing that they're all connected together in sort of an accordion fashion.
Yes.
You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to make it look like it's an actual deck.
Music. Ellie! Up! A candle. Our next trick will be that of turning a banana into an egg.
And let's see, the egg trick gets ruined. The egg trick is out. And then for no apparent reason, they have a big cake that they bring in. And Ollie, also for no real reason, throws it off stage and it decorates Jack Benny. So it's, it's not the funniest thing they ever did, but it still manages to be a highlight of this film, and certainly the highlight for most audiences who encounter this movie today.
The egg trick is out. But nevertheless, We will show you how to put a large cake into oblivion. Get the cake. And I shall endeavor to show you that the hand is quicker than the eye. Watch. Now then, cease.
But Ollie carries it, and the more you watch Laurel and Hardy, the more you realize how Ollie really carries so many sequences and so many films. I mean, the stories tend to be built around him, with Stan trying to be an assistant and then bungling it. But you have to have a more forward, a more active partner to carry the story, to write the story about, and Ollie fits that bill. And so once again, he is really the one guiding this whole sequence.
Fix the table.
I fall down and go blop.
And this is Laurel and Hardy's fourth talking film, because they've done Unaccustomed as We Are, Birthmarks, and had they done Men of War? I guess they've done Men of War.
Yes, yeah, that's the last one they just filmed.
So you just did Men of War, I guess.
Yeah, that was the last film we covered, Men of War.
Well,
so I think
had I had the gorgeous new restoration of it, I would have sent you a copy of it, and you could have mentioned that in your in your podcast.
Oh, really?
Well, maybe you can do a follow-up. I should probably send you a copy of that just so you can see it. And
oh, I'd love to see that. That would be fabulous.
It's going to be in Definitive Restorations Volume 2, and Jeff Joseph and Ray Fiola have done a magnificent job of restoration on it. And they, as I say, they found a full aperture copy of it, which has the full picture area, which we have never seen, because every print we've ever seen has had the left part of it chopped off for the optical soundtrack. So anyway, that's another film, but it does show you how well Laurel and Hardy adapted to sound. There's nothing stilted about Ollie's performance, even though he was pretty much a film actor only, and what vaudeville experience he had was as a singer. Still, he had no problem whatsoever as a vocal actor. He has a wonderful voice. It's very musical. His speaking voice is very musical, and more and more, I'm convinced that he is the finest film actor of his generation. Really, I mean, his performances are so genuine and so heartfelt, and even with the looks to the camera and the fluttery gestures and all of that, they never come across as being overly theatrical or artificial. I mean, everything
it's not contrived.
No. So anyway, that is on full display in this sketch.
What I like about that is with the format of this being like a variety show on theatre. Yes. We don't just get Ollie's looks to camera. He can actually talk to us in this, because it's supposed to be a theatre performance, right, yes, which is quite unusual, which is really nice.
That's right. It is played entirely to us. He's looking right at us all the time.
It's really nice.
And I'm glad they do. I'm glad they do that, because they could have directed it. Sometimes you have scenes like this where they're directed to look down, because the audience would be lower down from where they are on the screen. But it actually is much more effective to look directly at the camera. So I'm glad that's the way that they shot this.
Yeah, it's really nice. And also, I mentioned I was talking with the late Danny Backer and Bernie Hoj in the previous, and their new book flagged up this point which had escaped me, where Stan in, I think it was April 1916, was part of a magic act, a double act called Martini and Maximilian, and I wonder how much of that act goes into this, because as you say, he must have had to come up with that pretty damn quick. And the fact that he doesn't speak in it makes me wonder if that, if it's just basically he's taken it and lumped it into this film.
That could very well be. We'll have to look at A.J. Marriott's Stan Laurel solo stage book and see if we have any reviews that will tell us a little more about that particular sketch.
I think I did have a look at that. The only description we had stands a 1957 letter mentions this Martini and Maximilian sketch, where he describes the act.
And AJ's got some clippings with advertisements for them as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I don't think it actually says really, how much he did, what they did. But one may conclude that Stan took the job as Martini had definite bookings, and Stan was having no joy getting bookings since leaving the Keystone Trio. And he stayed with the act around a year. So he's obviously, we have that to fall back on. And I suspect he's lifted that act and put it into the Hollywood Revue.
Yeah, that's very likely. And by the way, not long ago, I was able to buy at auction a script for, I think it's Hurley, Stan, and Wren. It's a 1915 vaudeville script, typed up by Stan Laurel. Wow. And so now we will know what that sketch was. And also along with it, there was a contract signed by Edgar Hurley, and it was for the Gus Sun time, which was like the lowest rung ever of vaudeville. There was the Orpheum, the Pantages, the Keith Albee, and there was the Gus Sun time, which was like the smallest theaters in the most far-flung places ever. So that's where they were in 1915. But anyway, that came up for auction, and I was able to get that. So I'm hoping to do another scripts book if I get some more scripts. So cross your fingers for me.
Oh, I hope so. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's get through the rest of these here. We have Marion Davies doing a number called Tommy Atkins on Parade.
Just take a look at Tommy Atkins. They're all proud of Tommy Atkins. Can shout aloud to Tommy Atkins. Oh, what a man, what a man. Hear the lady chatter with a long romantic sigh. Every heart goes pitter-patter when Tommy Atkins marches by.
Now, I suspect that people in England would be more familiar with that name than people in the States. Tommy Atkins is a slang term for a British soldier. And it comes about because in the late 1800s, where military personnel were required to fill out a lot of different forms, when they were being instructed as to how to do this, the generic name that they would put on the form for whatever soldier was coming by, they instead of John Doe, they put Tommy Atkins. Yeah. And so that's why British soldiers became known as the Tommies during World War I.
Tommies, yeah.
There's also a poem by Rudyard Kipling called Tommy, which is about the British soldier at large. So that's why it's because where Marion Davies is dancing, she has a chorus line of boys who are dressed like the Queen's Guards with the high fuzzy black hats. So the beef eaters, as I guess we would call them. Let's see. We have the Brock sisters, all three of them doing a tune called Strike Up the Band, which is not the George and Ira Gershwin tune of a few years later. What else? More coordinated motion, more not dancing. Then there's an actual intermission. And then when the film starts up again, the musicians enter and you see them taking their seats and tuning up their instruments. So this really is played out as if it's a theatrical experience more than a film. They have a tableau of jewels featuring the Albertina Rash Ballet, whom we will also see in the Rogue Song. And that, ironically, is one of the few sequences of that film that has survived. We don't have the Laurel and Hardy stuff, but we do have the Albertina Rash Ballet material. Albertina Rash was married to Dmitri Tiomkin, who subsequently became a well-known composer for movies. Let's see. We have a model who rises up out of a big clamshell, like one of Botticelli's models, and she is wearing a costume that is very definitely pre-code. So that's one of the blessings of this film being made in 1929 and not after the middle of 1934. Buster Keaton does the Dance of the Sea. in which he is supposed to be some sort of a mermaid, and he very clumsily dances all around the set. There was supposed to be a scene there with Marie Dressler, which was evidently planned but not shot. But there's a gag in the Keaton sequence where he's at the top of a stairway, and all of a sudden the steps collapse, and it makes it one long steep ramp, and he slides down this ramp onto the floor. Well, that's a reworking of a gag that he had done in a 1920 short of his called The Haunted House. So he probably suggested that little bit of business. Gus Edwards, who was famous for his schoolroom routine, which had a lot of young performers, many of whom became famous comedians later on. He does a number called Lon Chaney Will Get You If You Don't Watch Out. And ironically, Lon Chaney, Greta Garbo, and Ramon Navarro are the three major MGM stars not in this movie. But Chaney is referred to in this number. And earlier on, Conrad Nagel and Cliff Edwards do a joke about Greta Garbo. So Ramon Navarro is the only one who's left out in the cold, not mentioned at all in this movie. And once again, now there's another Adagio dance. Jack Benny introduces the Natasha Natova Company, and there is actual dancing, but really it's a poor woman being flung around the set by these two guys. Strikes us as being rather painful and not terribly entertaining. So once again, highly unusual dancing, not like what you would find in Fred Astaire movies a few years later. And once again, one of the more famous numbers, and the first one that still survives in Technicolor. I don't know. I suspect that there were a couple of other sequences in this film that were originally in color that we don't have anymore. And of course, the color here is two color. It's not the full spectrum of color. So it's predominantly orange and green more than the full spectrum of color. But it's Norma Shearer and John Gilbert doing the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. And as almost always seems to happen, it's performers who are far too old for those roles, because Romeo and Juliet are supposed to be respectively 16 and 14 in the play. And they do it as written by Shakespeare. And then Lionel Barrymore, who would be the credited director for the Rogue Song, is revealed to be the director of this scene. And he gets news that they want this sequence to be updated for 1929. And so they have Norma Shearer and John Gilbert now performing it in 1929 slang, which, of course, seems far more dated than William Shakespeare of the late 1500s.
Well, if they want to make it modern, we'll make it modern. As the king commands, the slaves obey.
Righto. Now listen, boyfriend. You have a nice line of chatter, but how do I know you care for me in a big way?
Julie, baby, I'm gaga about you. No kidding, honey, your teeth are like pearls. Your eyes are like diamonds, and your lips like rubies.
You talk like a pawnbroker.
No, on the level, honest. You're the pansies in my garden, the cream in my mocha and java, the berries in my pie.
You're certainly playing a pretty symphony for my ears. And I've got to admit, you're very easy on the eyes, too. I've had plenty of balcony bees buzzing about me, but you're just about the cookies to me, boyfriend.
You're the cream in my mocha and java. I've had plenty of balcony bees buzzing around me. So once again, this is a movie very much of its time, and that's part of its value, really. It doesn't make it any more entertaining for modern day audiences, but anyway, it's a time capsule. Then we have Singing in the Rain with a G on the end of singing, and Cliff Edwards, the Brox sisters, a very popular vocal trio. They were sort of predecessors to the Boswell sisters and the Andrews sisters, and they all do Singing in the Rain. And once again, now we have boys and girls in raincoats. This time they're hopping. They've sat and swayed, they've jumped, they've thrown people, they've done the top hats. Now they're hopping up and down. They keep finding new ways to not dance. So that's another big musical number. We have a couple of numbers featuring Charles Kane, Gus Edwards, and Cliff Edwards together. At one point, they pretend to play a xylophone, which then self-destructs. And then we have another number with Marie Dressler, Polly Moran, and Bessie Love. once again, moderately amusing. And then another color sequence with Charles King doing a song called Orange Blossom Time. And that too was featured on many recordings of that time. And that gives way to another dance by the Albertina Rash Ballet. And in that one, the staging is actually much better, where they do find a way to have a dance number and fill up most of the frame instead of having all the action happening way down at the bottom of the frame with a big empty nothing up top. Finally, we have Singin' in the Rain, in which there is a gigantic backdrop of Noah's Ark and a rainbow. And this is in color, or two-color Technicolor. And everybody's in it except Laurel and Hardy, because this was more than likely shot before Laurel and Hardy were even thought of as being additions to the movie. And so you see Panning, you see George K. Arthur and Joan Crawford and Davies, and Keaton is not singing. That's rather interesting. Everybody else is singing, or at least pretending to sing, and Keaton rather obviously is keeping his mouth shut. And whether that is a silent protest against the way that he's feeling about being an MGM star and no longer being his own producer, I don't know, but it is kind of interesting. And so the film finishes, and then there's a title that says Finis, Finis, to give it a little extra dash of continental flair.
Yes.
Part of this film was shot by Irving Reese, I guess it's pronounced, Ries, who had filmed The Lucky Dog many years earlier.
Of course.
I don't know what sequences he filmed. It would be interesting if he had shot the Laurel and Hardy scene and had made contact with them again 8 years later. And Al Boasberg wrote most of the dialogue. He later became well known as a radio comedy writer and also worked for the Marx Brothers. And the director is Charles Reisner, who kept alternating the spelling of his last name from Riesner, which is the way it's spelled here, and which is the way that his son Dean always spelled it. But then you find many films like some of the he did a Marx Brothers film. I can't remember if it's The Big Store, but there he's Reisner. So it kept flip-flopping back and forth, and he didn't seem to care either way. But his son Dean is actually in a Chaplin film. I don't know if it's A Day's Pleasure, one of the films around that period. And he too was interviewed for a Chaplin documentary by Kevin Brownlow. And so Dean always spelled it Riesner. So there you are. So there, in a rather large nutshell, is the Hollywood Revue of 1929. Once again, a big hit, well regarded by critics and audiences, and so well regarded that MGM decided to let producer Harry Rapf, RAPF, do another one the next year. And so they were going to do the Hollywood Revue of 1930. And they shot many musical numbers for this, all in two-color Technicolor. But unfortunately, unlike this film went way over budget and way over schedule, and also with the encroaching dislike on the part of the public of musicals. They just had enough of them. MGM finally pulled the plug on that film, and the musical numbers that they had filmed wound up being inserted into two reel shorts made by MGM. Several of the shorts featuring Ted Healy and the Three Stooges that were made by MGM have these numbers originally intended for the Hollywood Revue of 1930, which was later retitled The March of Time, but it was never completed. And then Harry Rapf then tried to produce Hollywood Party, which was originally called Hollywood Revue of 1933, and that has a tortuous I call dibs on that one when you have to do that one, because that was in production for over a year. It cost $900,000, which was something like 5 times what it cost to make Sons of the Desert, and it wound up being this 68-minute nothing basically, and the two highlights were made by outside independent producers, the highlights being the Walt Disney cartoon Hot Chocolate Soldiers and the Laurel and Hardy sequence, Laurel and Hardy being on loan from Hal Roach Studios. So that really spelled the end of Harry Rapf's career as a feature film producer, because he'd had these two films that were very expensive and just not well managed at all. And so they let him make short subjects after that, but that was pretty much it. So
yes, right.
So
there we go.
there we have
There we
it.
go.
Hollywood Review in a nutshell. If you really like it, there are several records of the songs from the film, and it is available, at least in the States, on DVD. I'm sure you can get it around the world if you're really that desperate to have a copy.
That desperate.
If you only want the Laurel and Hardy sequence, that is in the double DVD set of The Devil's Brother and Bonnie Scotland. They were kind enough to add for us the Laurel and Hardy scenes from Hollywood Revue of 29 and Hollywood Party. So if you don't want to slog through the rest of those movies just to get to the Laurel and Hardy sequences, why, you can have just those and be done with it. So there you are.
I think sort of wrapping it up, really, I think, I'm not a fan of it. It is, I find it very, very hard going. In fact, I sat down to watch it probably 3 times in preparation for this and fell asleep every single time before Laurel and Hardy even came on.
Well,
so that was how I struggled with it. But having said that, and as awful as I think it is in most parts, and this is only my opinion, I think at least it did give us those 6 minutes or however long it is of Laurel and Hardy doing something that we don't normally get to see them performing to the camera. I mean, this is probably as close to a stage performance that we can actually see on film.
They were starting to do stage appearances around this time.
Yes.
They did that week at the Fox in San Francisco in 1929, later on in 1929, which actually involved Charlie Hall as a plant in the audience. And he evidently came up and they got into a fight where they started tearing each other's clothes. So those reciprocal destruction scenes were really prevalent in those early years. I'm glad they did finally progress beyond them, though, because it did get to be a bit much after a while.
Yes, they did it to death, I think, to be fair. Absolutely right. But no, and I can't help but think every time I watch Jack Benny, and I don't know Jack Benny at all, I have to admit, so I can't sort of think, well, I can see his later character developing.
Right.
For me, I find him pretty awful as the MC, and I would have loved to have seen Groucho Marx do that, because I think he would have been fantastic. However, he probably would have made fun of all of the acts, and I think that would have been more appealing to me, to see the act and then to see him come on and just totally rip them to shreds.
There were several people who were famous just for being the master of ceremonies in vaudeville bills like this. That's how Bob Hope first came to prominence. He was a master of ceremonies. Frank Fay also was another one. There was a guy named Jack Pepper, and who was married to Ginger Rogers at one point, and they had an act called Ginger and Pepper. You can see him in some Metrotone movie shorts, and he's actually quite enjoyable, Jack Pepper. Every act that comes on, he says, "Did you enjoy that? I wrote it." Whatever act it is, you enjoy them? I wrote it. So there was a skill to that. And I also mentioned Harry Rose, who's very hammy and theatrical, almost beyond belief. But again, it's valuable to have these things just to see how different stage performance was from film performance, and to get a taste of vaudeville beyond the acts that later transitioned into radio and television, but were now performing in a very different way from what they had done in vaudeville. I mean, really, our only other record of that whole field of show business is the Vitaphone shorts that were made by vaudeville acts, some of which are still very entertaining, and others of which you look at them and you say, well, here's why vaudeville died. So and there were still remnants of that in the 60s on television. I remember as a kid, the Ed Sullivan Show would bring in all these acts from Europe who were jugglers or trapeze artists or animal acts or things that really would have had no venue in American show business, but were still popular in different things in Europe, maybe in circuses. So that was all very much a part of vaudeville. I remember interviewing Arlene Bletcher, widow of Billy Bletcher, they had both worked with Babe Hardy in Jacksonville in the Vim comedies in 1916. And I was interviewing her in 1980, and she still had a very retentive memory. And she told me, she said, well, Billy and I were in vaudeville before we were in movies. And she said, at one point we were in a theatrical boarding house because a lot of other places just wouldn't accept actors. We were considered to be the lowest of low, and they didn't want to have us. So there were theatrical boarding houses. And she said that we, at one point, were in a room next to a guy who had a trained parrot and a trained dog. And she said he had to go into New York City to talk to his booking agent to figure out what his schedule was going to be like for the coming season. And when he came back, the poor dog was exhausted because the parrot had been telling him to do tricks all day.
Oh, that's
said,
fantastic.
Now that is a pure vaudeville story.
Yeah, that's great.
So,
oh, fantastic. Oh, I love it.
So it's
brilliant.
a bygone style and era of show business, and it is to some degree preserved in Hollywood Revue of 1929, even though many of the performers here were not really vaudeville people. Joan Crawford was not really in vaudeville. She won dance contests before she became part of the MGM roster and so on. But it's still part of that theatrical style. And also the fact that so much of it is shot as if it's on a theater stage. Well, that's what you would have seen had you been in a theater at the time. So, it has good points as well as bad.
And I guess it acts as a nice sort of swan song for a number of the acts who were in there, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, we as I say, many of the people at roster, if you say, well, how many of these people were still stars by 1933? And a lot of them weren't anymore. So,
yeah.
Again, it's a time capsule.
End of an era. Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. And I think that's, we have to, I always keep on coming back to context with these things. We have to see these things in context, or consider them in context. And because it's a head scratcher. Why was this film so popular at the time? But of course, they hadn't seen many talkies.
Right.
And they sort of soaking up all these people singing, and I was going to say dancing. I'll use that term loosely.
Yeah, well, we're seeing this 96 years later, having been inundated with variety shows of all popular, all kinds. I mean, we still have them with all the talent shows that are on today, which are basically variety shows. So it doesn't have the thrill for us that it would have for audiences in 1929. But again, it also makes you appreciate Laurel and Hardy, the fact that their films made at the same time and even earlier hold up so well, whereas so much of this other material that was considered to be sophisticated and smart and the ultimate in entertainment doesn't hold up at all. So it speaks to the universal quality of Laurel and Hardy's humor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And also, and I always wonder if I feel this way because I'm a Laurel and Hardy fan and not a fan of, say, Joan Crawford. But when the boys come on in the Hollywood Revue, it just lifts the whole thing. The quality of their little segment is so much. Oh, I feel even the Buster Keaton one. When I thought Buster Keaton's, great, Keaton's in this. Let's wait for it. And I thought, oh no, is that it?
Yeah.
Is that all you're gonna do?
Yeah.
That's such a disappointment. But the Stan and Ollie part, I think, is just real quality that shines out.
Well, yeah, even though it's not the greatest thing they ever did, it's certainly the highlight for many people. But give Joan Crawford a try. Go see Mildred Pierce. She's great in that.
Right. As long as she doesn't sing and dance.
She doesn't sing and dance. She won an Oscar for it, and deservedly so. So we see her in Mildred Pierce. Yeah.
Mildred Pierce. Okay, brilliant. Randy, thank you so much for imparting your wisdom. I mean, your knowledge is just, it never ceases to amaze me. It really does.
Well, I try. And if you haven't done Hooskow yet, I'd love to do Hooskow.
Oh no, we're still in the early stages of talking, so we'll be getting there shortly.
You still have They Go Boom to do, I think.
Yes, Perfect Day.
Okay,
we've got to do Perfect Day next.
Okay, Perfect Day will also be Perfect Day will also be in the forthcoming Definitive Restorations Volume 2. Yes, and you'll have it with both the original soundtrack and the one with the music added, and that one looks great.
Brilliant.
And as I mentioned, Blotto you'll have. In the actual legit silent version, cut to 2 reels. So that's an interesting alternate of Blotto. So anyway, lots of wonderful surprises yet to come this year.
Definitely. And the other thing, which is a little bit of a downer, Richard Bann mentioned the other day that some of the locations have been demolished. The big business house, the first, not the Finlayson
house. No, the duplex at the beginning of the film.
Duplex.
has been not as a result of the fires. But evidently the building was falling apart, and that parcel of land is very valuable, obviously, and so it has been torn down. But we did have it for a good number of years, and in the photo gallery, which I'm putting together for the forthcoming 1929 Year 3 edition, which will be available from Flickr Alley. It'll have different extras in the UK version, but the United States version will have stuff that I'm putting together. And I do have a really good color photo of that duplex from a few years ago. So you'll get to see what it looked like not all that long ago. So, yeah, unfortunately, we don't have that, but we still do have the Finlayson house, and we have all three of the Perfect Day houses right next to each other, and they all look great. And I don't think the Music Box Steps are going anywhere anytime soon.
Let's hope not.
Every October, that community still has a big celebration, the Music Box Steps Day, and they've done that for over 20 years, so that's great. So.
Of course, that's great.
So
it was Bob Satterfield that discovered the duplex, wasn't it? I think
very probably he would go many years ago in the early 70s. He would go just traveling around that neck of the woods looking for houses. He would just come with a whole bunch of stills and try and find houses that matched. There is nice confirmation of Music Box, because there's a great still that says Vendome and Del Monte. There's a street sign right there. Now, I don't know if Bob had that still, but that is confirmation that it is what it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
So we do know precisely where that one is. Now, unlike Buster Keaton, evidently would cover up street signs. He didn't want those showing in his movies, so that makes it a little bit harder to do the detective work to find out the Buster Keaton locations.
Yeah.
But Laurel and Hardy, we know quite a few of them. So.
Yeah. Oh, talking of Buster, that was the other house that was demolished as well. It was Buster's little bungalow, wasn't it?
Yeah, evidently one that he lived in the 40s. And I don't know exactly where that was, but yeah, well.
It's just around the corner from. I think it's just around the corner from Finlayson's house. I think, if I remember right.
Well,
it's in that sort of area.
Also, right around the corner there is where Beanie Walker lived. And also not far from that is where the Bacon Grabber's house is still there, and that was Elmer Regus's house. So that the Cheviot Hills was a fairly new community. Most of those houses were built in 1925, and so a lot of the Hal Roach people were buying those up because they were nice houses, they were new, and they were very close to the studio. So a lot of movies. If you go through the census records of 1930. And you look through that neighborhood, you find a lot of people that are employed by the studios. So that's always fun research.
Fantastic, Randy. Thank you so much indeed. And hopefully, I think it was 12 months ago since we last spoke. So let's make sure it's.
Let's not have another year go by.
No, absolutely not. No, but if we do the Huskow, then that's coming down in just a few months' time.
Yes, that's one of my favorite shorts, and particularly impressive for an early talkie. So I would love to talk about that one.
Wonderful. I'll hold you to that. Thank you so much, sir.
All right, sir.
Lovely to talk to you, Randy.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye.
And so the curtain drops on our look at the Hollywood Revue of 1929. I hope you enjoyed our coverage of this film, and maybe that it's inspired you to watch the film again, perhaps with fresh eyes and from a more informed viewpoint. If you'd like to hear more about the film, I'd really recommend another podcast episode. It's a show called Yesteryear Ballyhoo Review, and it's episode 132. 132 is well worth a listen, and it kind of comes from a perspective focused on Jack Benny and Marion Davies. The two, the host and the guest, are experts in both of those subjects. So coming at it from a slightly different angle, but a really interesting discussion about the film. So do check that out. Yesteryear Ballyhoo Review. For all patrons, be on the lookout for another exclusive premium episode of the podcast coming very soon, where we will dig deep into the contemporary trade papers and archives once again. And remember, for links to do with anything related to the podcast, be it becoming a patron of the show, changes to the magazine, or updates on my Laurel and Hardy silence book, just visit laurelandhardyfilms.com. Links to all that you can find in the podcast show notes, as well as links to purchase Randy Skretvedt's books, and also Scott Iman's book, The Speed of Sound. I'll pop a link on for that as well, and much more besides. So thanks for joining me once again and sharing in our love for all things Laurel and Hardy. And until next time, it's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
And a very goodbye from me. Goodbye.